Hi, everyone. Good to see you all again. If you were with us for the opening ceremony, you are now in the session with Claudia Foxtree and Debbie Irving, Decolonizing, Placing Indigenous People in the Conversation. I'm so excited to reintroduce Claudia Foxtree, who identifies as a multiracial Indigenous woman. She's a special education teacher, a social justice educator, an activist, and is currently on the board of the Massachusetts Center for Native American Awareness and the United Confederation of Taino People. Also with her is Debbie Irving. Debbie is a good friend, inspired by what she calls, I love this, Debbie, her own 2 steps forward, 1 step back journey away from racial innocence. Debbie educates other white people confused and frustrated by racism by transforming anxiety and inaction into empowerment and action. Her book, Waking Up White, tells the story of how she went from well-meaning to well-doing. And we're so honored to welcome you both presenting in the very first session for our virtual conference. So thank you for being here, and take it away.
I did a formal introduction last session, so I want to give Debbie a chance to introduce herself, and I'll just remind folks, Claudia Foxtree, she, her. I am on Pawtucket land next to the Massachusetts and the Nipmuc, and I am Arawak. My ancestry is European in Germany and Indigenous in the Caribbean, although that is still a colonized area. So the Arawak would have not been held by the same boundaries as the colonizer state and would have been all over the islands and mainland. Debbie? I can't see or hear Debbie.
Yes, Debbie, you are on mute, darling.
You would think this many months into Zoom life. I was saying thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Daisy. Thank you, everyone at Embracing Equity. I have learned so much about land acknowledgements from Claudia. And I know, Claudia, I read this morning that you have a piece about land acknowledgements on the platform here. So I encourage everyone to look at that. I think today, and one of the things that Claudia has taught me is how important it is. There is no one right way to do a land acknowledgement, that we really need to have it resonate with our particular practice, the context that we're standing in. And I feel the context I'm hearing today is we're here to really examine the intentional miseducation that we are all trying to recover from and disrupt. And so I'm going to give my land acknowledgement through that lens. I'm speaking to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts. I am 61 years old. I have spent all but 3 of those 61 years living in Massachusetts. And it was only at the age of 58 that it was pointed out to me by Claudia Foxtree that my state name, Massachusetts, is an Indigenous term. So think of how many times I said the word Massachusetts. I mean, hundreds of thousands of times, maybe, without even making the connection that I'm using an Algonquin term. So Massachusetts is an Algonquin term that means at the large hill. Masa means large, Achu means hill, and et is a suffix like burg or ville to designate place. It's extraordinary to me to think about the cognitive distortions as somebody who is white, who is out of the colonial settler legacy, the cognitive distortions that white supremacy put into my mind that made it possible for me to live in Massachusetts and not say, where did that word come from? To climb Mount Monadnock and not say, what does the name of this word mean? I do have an upper class background, so we belong to a country club. The logo of our country club was a teepee, a wigwam, whatever we want to call that word. And I never asked, why is that? So Daisy, I think I would change up the word in my bio. I maybe used to say racial innocence. I feel like ignorance is really, there's this intentional training that I underwent to ignore signs that were right in my face all around me. And so as a white person, making visible the invisible is a huge piece of my anti-racist practice. Speaking what I wasn't supposed to speak is a huge part of my anti-racist practice. And there is no better place, in my opinion, to start that practice than with Indigenous people, the first people to endure the wrath of white supremacist thinking, culture, justification, violence, terrorism. And it's all around us every day, everywhere. I was taught that Indigenous people, first of all, Indians was the word. It wasn't Indigenous people. There was this myth about this land that my ancestors came to being uncivilized, being a wilderness. And no, absolutely not. I'm not just on the land of the Massachusetts. The Massachusetts people is an incredibly, as Tricia said, complex society. There were all kinds of, once I started understanding whose land I was on, there were multiple groups that are overlapping and intersecting and working in concert with one another. The societies are incredibly complex. And so for me, when I do a land acknowledgement, I really want, as a white person, I want to bring to life not only the fact that I am on land that is ancestral and unceded Indigenous land. I want also in my land acknowledgements to bring to life the degree of cognitive distortion that was planted in me so that I wouldn't see. So I think I'll end there. And Claudia, I don't know if people know what they're in for, but you want to tell them what this format is that we're about to do?
I was thinking about doing that, yes. So Debbie and I have a conversation. It's unscripted. We didn't plan it. It's wherever the conversation goes. So every one of these talks, presentations is unique. And then at about 30 minutes in or so, we will give you a chance to go into some breakout rooms to process what you've heard and ask questions in a small group. And then we will take questions back in the large group that came out of your small groups or that you had based on something we said. You can throw things in the chat, although we may not address it right away as we're speaking, but we'll take a look at it while you're in the small groups. Did I miss anything?
I think that's it.
And I wanted to say something about tribal land acknowledgements. I used to just call them land acknowledgements, and they are land acknowledgements. And now I call them tribal land acknowledgements because I want to be clear that I'm talking about Native nations, American Indians, Native Americans, the Indigenous people of the Americas, in terms of tribal land acknowledgements here. And why did that happen? Because I've been doing it for a few years now, and I've had people talk about land that we're not actually on and say, well, I want to acknowledge this land or that land, and not even in the United States. And I'm like, I want to be really clear. It's about the land you're currently on or the land that you're talking about. Like, I visited this place in the United States, or I was born in this place in the United States. And there's the formal tribal land acknowledgement when you open up an event. It could be every single time a 10-week course meets and someone else takes it each time. And then there's the more informal tribal land acknowledgement that you would do in an introduction. So if you're saying your pronouns, you are also saying whose land you're on. And it's as simple as that. So there's these two kind of parts of it. So there's the formal, and then there's the one everyone can do when you are speaking, when you're the one who's on the floor. And I'm not sure that that's always clear to folks, because I've also been told, the group just did a tribal land acknowledgement. Why did you do another one? Because there's a lot of what Debbie's right, ignorance, just not knowing and not having it pointed out. So I like to make those kinds of things explicit before people kind of do it. And then I have to say, well, just like, for example, when I talk about race and racism, I use the term white. I don't use the term Caucasian. And at one point I might have. However, I learned the history of how Caucasian came out of Negroid, Mongoloid, Caucasoid, and classifying racial groups and who was better and who was worse and who was smarter and who was prettier. That's the history of that word being used in the conversations of race. And I also learned at the Sochi Olympics that the Caucasoid Mountains, which is where they were, is an ethnic group. It's a group of people from a particular region of the world. And so I'm like, well, that's just another reason. And the reality is, when we're talking about racism in the United States, and we want to mention things like segregation, those water fountains said white only. It did not say Caucasian only. And it's really clear when I'm working with kiddos that that white is the word. And over time, it's been used in legislation. People who say, well, I'm from the Caucasoid region, I should be Caucasian. They say, no, well, it's really about being white. So it's clear that that's the word when we're talking about race and racism. And it's not about literal skin color. It's about the privileges that come with that term, that classification, that observation of how people are reading you. So I just need to say some vocabulary. And yes. I'm going to mix in Indigenous, Native American, possibly American Indian. You know, I like to use the word tribe, nation, but tribe comes up, like tribal governments and tribal land acknowledgement. It's kind of like United Negro College Fund. We don't use that word, but that's what it is. Or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. There's places where the language stays and there is no good term except the term of the nation, but we're not always talking about the specific group. So, you know, the indigenous people of what is now known as North and South America, but was known by something else before 1492 is just too long. And pretty much all those words have problems, but don't have as many problems as other words that were actually used as racial slurs. So, you know, if I were formally writing, I might explain why I'm going to use which word. Here in this informal conversation, I just want to be explicit that there's problematic pieces to all the words. I tend to use Indigenous because that's what's in the legislation these days, like Indigenous Peoples Day. And Indigenous is anybody who's Indigenous to a group. I mean, there are people who were Indigenous to Africa who were brought here, who were still Indigenous to Africa, right? So the word itself is problematic as well. When I'm using it today, it will be for the Indigenous people of what's now known as North and South America. And I don't like to use the political boundaries because, of course, they didn't. They lived in as a good ally, me being an ally to all of the nations. I have to remember that those boundaries were not as, they had boundaries and territories, but they were not the same as the political boundaries we now have.
You know, as I'm listening to Claudia, I'm thinking about how much disrupting whiteness you're already doing, because whiteness wants to give us nice, pat, easy answers where there's an exact, easy answer. So we don't ever have to debate everything because this is the one right way. And so already you're leading us into a conversation that's getting at the imperfection. You know, perfection is a white supremacist culture norm. There's a lot of imperfection. There's a lot of messiness. There's a lot of grappling. There's a lot of evolution of terms changing. And so I'm hearing all of that, you know, and what you're already saying. Okay, here we are. Like, it's not going to be perfect. We're all going to have to struggle and teach each other. Maybe a couple years ago, I used this term. Now I don't. And that really speaks to this is the opposite of the miseducation. The education is not a one and done. It's ongoing.
I am still learning. And what I love seeing is when I get to learn from other people's learning. So one thing that just this summer already, or maybe right before the summer, just recently, I saw happen and learned was I was doing a panel like this in a Zoom, and they had an ASL language interpreter, so American Sign Language. First of all, I said welcome, and I said I would be speaking in Indigenous language, and they could just say Indigenous language, and I then translate when I translate. And that was the extent of my conversation with them. I could have had so much more of a rich conversation with the sign language interpreters. That aside, like that was my own personal reflection in terms of my able-bodied privilege and that kind of thing, which I'm always kind of think of where my privilege, because that's where I have power. That's where I have control. That's my sphere of influence. And you might notice on this Zoom that our names cover up the bottom of the screen. So when you're doing sign language, it's sometimes low, like here. And you can't really see what's happening. And if you need it, that's problematic, right? So they have to stand far enough back. So somebody wrote in the chat, what is the sign for Indigenous people? And the ASL interpreter stopped, did the sign language and explained, because the person who wrote in the chat said that their partner what needed the interpretation and couldn't see the word. Now, here's the interesting piece about it. The word used in sign language used to be this, which you can clearly see, but she was not doing that. And it's a stereotype, right? You can see how this is a stereotype. So the ASL community has a new word and she was doing the new word and the person didn't see the new word, so they couldn't put it. So I'm going to show you, because this was a new learning for me as well. This is in the ground, right? So Indigenous people are from the ground. So the ground, and then a P for people. So Indigenous people. And I just thought that was like the coolest thing ever. Because the word changed in a community and now I can pass it on as well, you know, coming from the ground people.
That's I'm reading right now Joe Fagan's The White Racial Frame, and thinking about, you know, even, you know, American Sign Language is using the white racial frame because there's no Indigenous person in the world, I don't think, who would want this to describe your people. So it sounds to me like there must be, you know, Indigenous people are contributing to the conversation about what symbols do we use for what signs do we use for what.
Well, so here's the other thing. I love that Indigenous mascots, or I hate even putting Indigenous with it, but the mascots of for schools and sports teams, and even words that are taken from the Indigenous languages and Indigenous nations and used out of context for something else, like Winnebago, which you can't even think of the Great Lakes people anymore when you hear that word. There's an invisibility in making a caricature and using a mascot or taking a word out of context that makes the real people and contributions invisible. And then when you remove them, there's an invisibility as well, because now you've taken away even, which I totally support, and you no longer have the prompt of the conversation of let's talk about why this is wrong, right? So we have to keep talking in a different way. So by me saying that this is an Indigenous sign that came, I can see in the chat, from the Indigenous deaf community, I am passing on and making visible something that's Indigenous. When I talk about tribal land acknowledgements, that's the way now that we can be appropriate and make people visible. Instead of using the negative kind of imagery, how do we bring in the contributions and achievements and current status, which we should have been doing all along, to make visible appropriate things about Indigenous people?
Well, this reminds me, Claudia, of a conversation you and I had recently about how important it is when teaching anti-racism in schools to not just teach, I think I used the term the bad shit, but to teach about discrimination, marginalization, but for so many reasons. It's so important for someone like me, a white girl who grew up in a white suburb. I'm being fed stereotypes, negative stereotypes my whole life. And so a part of anti-racism education for me must include learning who people are. You know, example, if I'm learning about enslavement, it should start back in Africa. Learning about Indigenous issues today should start back European settlers. And I should understand the much fuller context, as well as, I think it's 3 parts. It's learning about the identity, the history, the culture of a targeted group, pre-target, learning what's being done, what has been done, what continues to be done to perpetrate harm on that targeted group, and then learning about all of the resistance, including, we learned about the resistance of joy as a form of resistance. And also, I think for our white students, there's such a narrative right now about you're making my white kid feel bad. One really easy counter to that is to always include in stories of resistance white anti-racists who have been a part of the mix. And so I just want to name it. It's been very much as we're getting ready for the school year to start, and I'll be working with a lot of schools to remind educators that all 3 of those pieces would really have helped someone like me. And I think a lot in terms of what would have helped me, someone like me, from not being so thoroughly miseducated.
There's so much that we don't learn. I love what you've said in previous conversations, is it's not just that we didn't learn it. It's that we learned an entirely incorrect version of it. Particularly we've been talking about the Thanksgiving story. So we're learning things about Indigenous people, and they aren't often accurate. And some places are getting better and some places are making movements. I want to offer up that this is the land that we live on. We live on what is now known as the United States. This entire country, its history, its wars, its the things that made it and its colonizer countries in Europe wealthy are all connected to the Indigenous people. The land, the people, what the people did in this was not a pristine wilderness land. All of that is part of the story. And therefore, anything that is taught here has an Indigenous perspective, anything. I remember teaching about the, it was called the Industrial Revolution, but we called it the industry unit. And we taught about the mills and the triangular trade system and the plantation system and the whaling system and trains and ferries and dams and all these other systems during industrialization, the industries. And so what is the Indigenous perspective? Because there is one for everything. Yes, Indigenous people were enslaved. Yes, Indigenous people were parts of some of those, but that isn't the biggest places they were impacted. Whose land do you think was flooded when that dam was created? Whose water was polluted when those mills were, textile mills were running? As you go through time and you look at, nuclear power or other kinds of waste, where do you think that waste was dumped? There is an Indigenous perspective to every single thing that happened in this land. And when I ask people name a treaty, nobody can typically name any treaty. How about name one of those white allies to Indigenous people? It's hard to come up with that. Name 5 Indigenous actors. Name 5 Indigenous musicians. I mean, it is hard to come up with anything. And we each need to be an ally by demanding that those things are included, because there is nowhere else in the world we could demand it. We did not have a mass exodus to another part of the world. Most Indigenous people are still here, generations later. And this is where that demand needs to happen. And we're 2% of the population, less in some areas, more in others. And so we often need to have the support of our allies. That is essential. So we need to know the white allies, we need to know the Black allies, we need to know the Asian allies. I mean, we need allies across racial groups to be part of the voice, not just the opening the doors, the transforming ourselves and knowing that there is an Indigenous perspective to everything we teach.
And I'm thinking about how convenient it was, convenient for white supremacy, that the first thing I was taught about Indigenous people was that Indigenous people were extinct. I mean, that was actually the word that was taught. And so if the not just the lack of education, but the miseducation includes that narrative, then I don't put any energy into looking for it. It feels like something that lived in the past that I don't need to worry about. So I think, every time we do make something visible, it's a chance to also correct that piece of the narrative.
Absolutely. And that entire piece of being in the past, often Indigenous people are taught in the early part of the year, September, maybe ending around Indigenous Heritage Month, which is November. And then it's not brought up again when it really needs to be the whole time. We are still here. And even if we were not here, that story is an important story to tell. I often think of when we do anti-racism work in school systems, we think we want to reflect our population. Well, if our population is all white, we want to reflect more than an all white curriculum. So it doesn't, in some ways it does matter, and in other ways it doesn't matter who our population is, because we need everyone to learn all of the stories, in particular the people of the land we're on, because it's through their destruction that we're even able to have these conversations, whether they are still living or not, even though they are. And you have to remember that that's part of settler colonialism and white privilege as well, because Indigenous people were told, had children taken away when they were identified. And so what do? You talk about not being Native, right? So you don't want to announce you're Native if you're going to have your children taken, or your tribal group's going to be terminated, which happened with the US legal system. You stop talking about it, and then it doesn't become live in your own community and your own family. And so we have increase in population without increase in birth, because people are reclaiming their heritage and have the right to do that.
Yeah, I had this conversation just a couple days ago. This is an example of how every single day almost there's an opportunity to bring this history in. So I had a conversation with a white man who's my age, I've known my whole life. A couple days ago, he's been supportive of what I do, but I wouldn't say he's out there doing the work. He's a minister. He's in the Christian faith. He's a minister. And he said, Debbie, I really want to talk to you. All of my alarm bells are going off. I feel so afraid that we're pre-genocidal. This man was part of the Rwanda Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And he said, all of these alarm bells are going off. I feel I'm hearing words like, vermin, and this is all pre-genocidal. We're otherizing people, we're demeaning people. And I'm so afraid for our country. And I thought about it a little bit, and I said, I wonder if what's happening is that for the first time in your life, you're understanding how much otherizing is happening, because otherizing has always happened. We are built on genocide and have never acknowledged it, let alone done a truth and transformation process. And so that resonated with him. Yet in the course of this conversation, which was about an hour and a half conversation, I learned he is highly educated at one of these schools that specializes in miseducation. That's our entire education system. This guy went to some of the best colleges, is a minister. He had never heard of Indian boarding schools. He did not know, he had no idea there was an Indigenous genocide. Not knowing about Indian boarding schools or the genocide as a Christian, again, this is this mind-boggling cognitive distortion, because Christianity was at the root of that. So when we don't know, this is, I think, a part of my introduction, like, we can't do better if we don't know better. So we have to know better, and we have to teach really differently. And I don't know if we want to talk about how difficult it is to teach something that isn't just new, but it's 180 degrees different from what the parents of, the teachers of, the administrators of our young people have learned.
On more than one occasion, I have done presentations and had folks come to me afterwards and say, I have a PhD in history and I never learned this. How do we do that? How do we get to the point of giving master's, PhDs, even diplomas from high school without any knowledge of the Indigenous people on the lands who you're on? That says something about settler colonialism and white privilege. And that's another thing I've learned. I can get behind white privilege. I understand it. I get it. I've read a lot of books. I've met a lot of people. I've lived that life. And it does not capture what's happening to Indigenous people. Indigenous people are all racial groups. So we cannot stop at just looking at anti-racism as the conversation when we talk about Indigenous people. I've been using settler colonialism, settler privilege to sort of capture that. There isn't a really good word. What are you going to say? Anti-colonialism, anti-settlerhood. I mean, there's just, maybe I'll invent one in my PhD, but right now, don't have a good word for that. And we need to be aware that Indigenous sovereignty, tribal nation sovereignty, is in addition to racism and discrimination that people have faced. And this is really important because the Indian Child Welfare Act, which took away children from their families under the "they can't raise them right and we will civilize them," was only ended in 1978. And it is being currently challenged, today, because the law talks about race, that the Indigenous race should be able to raise their own children. And that's not equal protection under the law, which the Constitution of the United States says any race should be able to raise those children. So it's basically trying to revert and go back. We can't keep using the word race in all Indigenous conversations, because this conversation is not about race. This conversation is about tribal sovereignty and a nation being allowed to raise their own children. We don't go to Germany and say, we don't think you should keep all those children, that we should be able to adopt them out. We don't tell nations what to do with their children. And so we have to include more language than just the race language when we are talking about Indigenous people. And I think Dina Julia Whitaker does a really good job of starting to lay this out. She wrote 2 articles. One is called Settler Privilege, one is called Settler Fragility. And she co-wrote 20 Myths About Indigenous People with Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz wrote Indigenous People's History of the United States, and Dina wrote As Long as the Grass Grows. Now, if that's not ringing a bell, that's a problem too, because most of the treaties in the US started with, you get this blank, 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 as long as the grass grows and the rivers flow. So the title of the book is from treaty language. And in there, she starts to lay out things about how it's more than race. And I believe her forthcoming book will talk more about that. So we'll actually have, a published author and book to continue this conversation about language and how we look at the ism of what's happening to Indigenous people.
This is so interesting. I'm totally thinking out loud. This is one of those moments where I'm going to say something you have never said before. I think about, in a way, like the term white supremacy has always felt incomplete to me, because it puts all the focus on race, and it doesn't talk about the fact that the whole mindset of white supremacy is otherizing and marginalizing by ethnicity, by gender, by ability, by religion. What am I forgetting? Ableism. I mean, there's so much, unless you're a white Anglo presenting, hetero presenting, Christian male, Protestant male, who's elite in an upper class. You're not in that power circle. And so I'm thinking about, it's like it's like settler supremacy.
That's her article, Settler Privilege and Settler Fragility. And what's really funny is she's beacon press, just like Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility.
Yeah, it's a supremacy. It's, okay, we're the minority power group, and every other group that isn't in this minority of the opulent. Have I told you that term that I came across that James Madison said?
No, but I liked when you were going to say Benjamin Franklin, because he studied with many Indigenous people.
Right, I know he did. And I would love to know what those conversations leading up to the Constitution looked like, because I think he might have held a different set of conversations or a different perspective than James Madison, who's on record as saying in that stretch of time that the whole point of this government we're creating is to protect the minority of the opulent from the majority. So that's where the divide and conquer strategy comes in. But, that minority of the opulent, I picture as being that, our founding fathers. We know what they look like. We know what they did, all the compromises in their lives. Compromised values in their lives. Where was I going with this? I've completely drawn a blank.
Well, you made me think of something. You were mentioning how it's really important to look for the white allies and the white role models. And I would put Benjamin Franklin in that at the time, because he did bring the ideas of the Iroquois Confederacy to the First Continental Congress. And he's not perfect. There's no perfect person. There's no perfect resource. That's why you got to read a ton to get the picture, because it's just nothing that does it all. I will say, having said that, and I say that all the time, no perfect anythings. Remember the Brutes on HBO is really close to perfect.
Exterminate
the Brute. Yes. Yeah. Help me with his name. It's Peck. Raoul
Peck.
It is really close. It includes a lot of Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's work, and it looks at worldwide, focusing on Indigenous peoples. A 4-part series, small doses, lots of breathing in between. But there is no perfect anybody. So finding allies, you have to find someone who did some things, even if not everything. We're all on a journey and aren't all there. And read a lot, view a lot, talk to people.
Yeah, and the fact that our founding fathers, there were a couple of them who went and studied with the Haudenosaunee, also known by the French as the Iroquois people. The Great Law of Peace. Great Law of Peace is an incredible thing to bring into our educations. This is the point I wanted to make. That minority of the elite, they use and they continue to use groups however they need to use them to advance their own wealth and power. And so for Indigenous people, that meant get rid of the people, take the land. For enslaved Africans, it meant we can't kill you. We need to use you for free labor. If you look at any targeted group, gender, ethnicity, and the intersections of all of that, it's always in service of building wealth and power. I'm really stating the obvious to this particular crowd, but that is what the supremacy is all about.
Debbie, I'm looking at the time, and I'm thinking it might be time to process a little of what we've all put out there.
Sounds good.
Thank you for dropping links in the chat of all of the resources we sort of said. What do you think? I think at least 15 minutes. Maybe 1 o'clock.
Are the groups going to be 4, 5, 6 people or so?
4 or 5. Yep.
I'm thinking this is a really well-informed, really motivated group. What about 20 minutes? Because I bet those conversations are going to
Let's go.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Is there a specific prompt you'd like to offer after folks introduce themselves, sharing their name, pronouns, organization, and role? Is there a specific prompt maybe we could kick it off in the breakouts?
I was thinking, what was something new that you heard from us speaking about, or a new connection you made.
And I think another interesting way to disrupt whiteness is sometimes when we get in groups, people have a tendency, either because they're extroverts or because of privileged identities, to speak more and others less. A good way to disrupt the unevenness of contribution to the conversation is what some people call serial testimony. So when you get in your group, if each person goes around, your name, your pronouns, maybe you know what land you're on, maybe your role at your organization, and then maybe like 15 seconds, just a quick bite about something that was new for you. So that, because sometimes the first person to speak, the entire conversation builds on that. And I think it's healthy to disrupt that. So you all have a little sense of everyone's voice and something that you're taking away that was new for you before you build your organic conversation.
That's
I love
great
that
strategy. Yes. Thank you so much. All right. So then you should be receiving your invitation to your breakout, and we will see you back here in 20 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you had some energizing conversations in your small group breakout session. Before we dive back into this conversation, we wanted to open up a moment to engage in that wholeness practice. So checking in with your bodies, going below the neck, and recognizing, where is there some energy in your body? Where do you feel maybe some heat? Is your heart pounding? Are you feeling excited from the connections you're making? Just take a second, to release any tension that may have built up. Take a deep breath. All right. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass it back to Claudia and Debbie.
I'm taking my deep breath in and out, and I have my therapy cat apparently too. This is Luna. I have 5 children and 4 cats, and 5 children I can deal with, but 5 cats is my tipping point. So just 4. We were looking at the chat during the break, and I wanted to speak a little bit about pain. This is really a painful topic for many people, particularly Indigenous people. And my family, as far as I know, did not have any children taken away in terms of boarding schools. We did in terms of missionaries, which would have been like mission schools in California. So that served a similar kind of feeling. And sometimes I think I don't have the right to be in pain because I didn't have someone who's being returned to me from a boarding school. But the reality is we all have pain from this, emotional pain. Some of us have physical pain because those schools weren't that long ago, for example, or continued problems like not having healthy water to drink because of uranium mines on the reservation, which is what happened to the Dene, the Navajo Nation, at the beginning of the COVID. They wanted PPE supplies and were shipped body bags. So this pain is ongoing. Even when I read the names of the children, I could feel my voice was going to crack, and I had to put it somewhere, the pain, so that I could say the names, because those names needed to be said. And this Friday, I'm going for my first time to the Carlisle Indian boarding school so that I can offer prayers to the children who are still there. And I had to submit paperwork because the school is on a military base, which I never even knew. And it just gave me a whole wave of nausea and pain again, that those schools were set up in a military way, and they're on a stinking military base now. So that pain is ongoing. It is re-traumatizing. In Canada, it's only been since 1996. There is a whole current population of people dealing with the fact that they were taken from their families, from their communities, and from their land. And speaking of colonial supremacy, it was an effort that resulted in taking land, because if you didn't live on your land for a certain number of years in a row, your land could be seized. So there's just so much complication to all of this, and pain involved with it as well. And then returning the bones.
I think about, I'm thinking about Resmaa Menakem's work. I know that that Embracing Equity is intimate with his work, My Grandmother's Hands, the idea of somatic abolitionism. And, I think for myself as a white person, it is so clear to me that I was taught not to feel, or not to feel certain feelings. It's all entangled with otherizing. Not to see people as fully human is a way for me to not feel for that person. I also know that I was taught just not to feel that much myself. We weren't supposed to be angry. We weren't supposed to rock the boat. Being angry was seen as a bad character trait. Being sad was, as a woman, was too emotional. So there was a lot of stuffing my own feelings as well, which is like a belt and suspenders approach to not feeling for other people. It all goes together. And so as I engage in this work, I notice again and again my own tendency to go up into my head and think, oh, I'm learning. This is exciting to be learning. And I have to be really disciplined about remembering to go down into my body and allow the pain in, both because it is painful and I should feel it and I shouldn't run from it. That's the whole, what was the word? Was it holistic or whole that you used, Daisy? Wholeness. The part of the wholeness is being able to feel the pain. And I sometimes have to go through an exercise like shutting my eyes and envisioning somebody coming to my house and taking my small children. I don't have small children anymore, but I will never forget having my small children. And it's not a stretch for me to imagine what would have happened to my psyche, my heart, if my children had been taken from my home. And so I literally put myself through the exercise of putting myself in other people's shoes to the extent that I can from my comfortable, 21st century home. And I really encourage other white people who might feel like you were similarly numbed down, that it is important to not just lean into pain and awkwardness and messiness in conversations like this, but go in search of it through that kind of exercise. For me, it's reawakening me. It's this, fragility, settler fragility, white fragility is a direct result of not having emotional resilience or emotional capacity. And so it's really important to build our emotional capacity. And that really starts with recognizing the degree to which I was taught not to feel here or between other people. And so I want to offer that white perspective up.
I love Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands. It is a different way to look at anti-racism because it includes the full body and the emotions in a way that some of the other books stay in your head. I'm not sure I would ever write that kind of book because I'm a stay in your head kind of person typically, but I do really love his book. He's a therapist. He talks about how white European cultures have for centuries have been trained to see pain, drawing and quartering people and using guillotines and all these other things, burning people at the stakes. And they brought that I can separate myself from that damage to this new continent with them. And so they also have a history of violence and pain that they need to recognize above and beyond or different than what was subsequently inflicted. Debbie and I would love to know what some of the things you talked about in your groups in our little bit of time left. If you could write in the chat a new learning, a new connection, that would help us all, we have over 100 people here, see what we have learned. And it'll be interesting to see if we've taken away the same kind of learnings as well. So, you know,
And I just saw a raised hand, Claudia. I'm not sure I'm going to say your name right, Michaela, or had a hand raised. I don't know if that was an accident or you did. Yeah, do you want to say something? Oh, that was an accident?
Well, I got too excited and I put the thing up before I heard the whole direction, so I'm sorry.
And you can put a hand up too. So there you go. You have the floor.
I feel really grateful for the group that I was in. And we shared our experiences to this work and how we got into this space today, and just how to take information after this experience and what does it mean to turn key into our respective places of work in a way that doesn't create tension or threat or even fear from the people who we work with who may or may not be where we are in our own journey, and thinking about what does it look like to do this in a tasteful way, still with a sense of urgency that we have. A lot of us were feeling like there's just so much, even we who think that we're semi ahead of the game or aligned in this work, like we don't know. And to be able to really feel prepared to get that information to people who need it desperately.
Thank you.
Do you want to speak to that at all, Claudia?
That's my life's work. When I have these conversations, there's so little that's known generally about anti-racism and specifically about Indigenous people that most people know almost nothing about the original people of this land. It almost doesn't matter where I start, and I choose to start with current events or current place where I am, and go from there. But I can do that now because I've gotten so many questions over 30 years that I almost can anticipate the kinds of questions that will come up. And that piece of aren't they all dead, that's been constant the entire time. That's the number one thing if you talk to Indigenous people, that they'll say is problematic. The idea that we are no longer alive and being spoken of in the past and only having 18th century imagery and, you know, on and on, museums, not part of an art museum, but only part of the anthropological sections of museums.
Are you done? I don't want to
Yes.
interrupt. Yeah,
No.
I'm thinking about the point of, like, I don't know where other people are. How do we do this in, you know, you use the word tasteful way and in a productive way where we don't get the kind of backlash that just shuts down the whole project. And I think some of the strategies that I've seen really useful with that is speaking from if we are not an Indigenous person and we're wanting to and motivate other people to get on board with Indigenous education, we can speak from our own perspective by saying something like, I am learning so much about Indigenous history that I never knew, and I'm disturbed I didn't learn it in school. I wish I had. Do you ever feel the same way? Or to start to, and it starting to poll people, like, and that can happen in casual conversations. You can also have a survey in your community saying, you know, with a couple questions on a scale of 1 to 5, how interested are you in learning more about Indigenous history and current issues? Or how would you rank yourself on how much you know? And there are a number of questions you can ask, but it's sort of going meta. So instead of getting right to the content, you get to, you start by getting on the threshold by saying, where are we? Who's interested? Who isn't? What are we interested in? And that's speaking from the I perspective of like, this is bothering me, is much less triggering to other people. Yeah. So we're using the hand raising. Oh, I see a message by Liz Strong. Should I read that?
Sure. Otherwise, I want to just say that if you scroll down the bottom of your screen, there's a reactions button. If you put up the other kinds of symbols, they disappear after 5 seconds. But if you want us to call on you, put up the raised hand.
Okay, so this is from Liz Strong. Hi, Claudia. Thank you so much for everything you have shared and letting us listen into your conversation with Claudia. So maybe this is both of us. Something that is on my mind in these conversations that I wish there was more visibility about is the relocation and internment of Native peoples.
I really like that language. I'm talking about Indigenous people today, and I often do. And in my broader anti-racism work, I think of other groups that have been oppressed or marginalized, vulnerable populations in the United States. I'm a special education teacher by training. And early in my learning, I learned about the Japanese American internment camps. And I had a friend who was and still is Japanese American. And she called them concentration camps. She didn't even call them internment camps. She said her father was in a concentration camp. She went to many of his talks. She was taking that on. And she would give the definition of a concentration camp. And it's what fits. So changing that language actually changes your idea of what those camps were, right? Those were concentration camps. What happened in Germany that we call concentration camps were death camps. The first, what we call reservations, were Indian praying, or one of the first Indian praying villages. Those were concentration camps. Those were, if you want to live, you will become Christian, and then we will put you in this camp. So the area that I live in Massachusetts, as well as other areas of Massachusetts, like Natick, had praying Indian villages. That's just a way of saying concentration camps. You know how when we learn about, if we have a good education about the history of how this country stole and enslaved people from Africa, we often hear about needing a pass to leave the plantation. That was also needed in what we call reservations, but were really concentration camps. When reservations started to be made and Indigenous people were relocated from the original lands to the reservation lands, they also needed passes in order to leave the reservation, and the president had to sign off on that. So those kinds of gatekeeping have gotten a euphemistic word, but isn't really what they were. So, reservations are concentration camps at one point. Now they probably, you could say reservation, but this is the sovereignty issue. Some nations out west have hundreds of acres. Superhighways go through them. During COVID, they wanted to close the reservation to outsiders. They were dealing with a pandemic. Well, how do you do that if the US government has a highway through your lands? So how much sovereignty do you have? How much do you own your own land? And these are just questions. I mean, Debbie has helped me describe, I can complicate things like crazy, or I'm not going to say crazy. That's not appropriate. I can complicate things. I don't have an answer. I just know it's complicated, and I can complicate it because you just start to ask questions.
And when you say I can complicate things, that's a positive.
Yes.
Yes. Because remember, whiteness wants us to simplify, to reduce, to get down to easy, simple answers that keep us from getting to root causes.
That's so
unless
beautiful. Great framing, Debbie.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we need to wrap up this session. Is there any closing remarks either of you would like to share before we close this opening keynote?
I appreciate everyone coming here to expand their conversation about race, racism, decolonization. And I've been monitoring the chat a little bit, and I loved hearing and seeing your new learnings. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and I think the word stamina is on my mind. I think self-care for white people can get really twisted into knots about I don't deserve it. I mean, my life is already so easy. And yet white supremacy wins when we grind ourselves down and we burn ourselves out. So self-care really is crucial for all of us. And my stamina definitely comes from my friends, the relationships. Anti-racism work is relationship work. And so just really nurturing my relationships in this world. It's 4-hour lunches with Claudia. Good example. It's important.
Yes. Thank you both.
And not only talking about race cross-racially for white people, like we're all whole people. So talk about everything. Talk about your pets and your everything. Bring your whole selves.
And we have in the next session, to bring it back to the beginning, Claudia, when you were talking about rejecting the term Caucasian and specifically using the word white racial identity, the next session is focusing on what is this white racial identity? How do white people need to show up in the anti-racist movement in solidarity with people of the global majority? And the white racial identity model was developed by Dr. Janet Helms in the 1990s and still hasn't been updated. And she's a Black woman. So it really elevates, how this labor has been shifted onto people of color time and time again. So Debbie, I really appreciate how you've modeled, even in this conversation, how white people can show up and engage and be imperfect, right? Not, I have nothing to add, but really contribute to this ongoing conversation, ongoing learning and unlearning, and the larger movement for anti-racism. Thank you both so much for sharing your wisdom and cultivating this space for us to show up and be in conversation. We hope to see you all in that next session. Carly and Katie Kitchens are going to be facilitating. So we'll see you there in an hour. Bye. Thank you.
No Coca-Cola. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Debbie.
He's 5'2" and he's 6